All right, so today we're going to be taking a deep dive into
Uh-huh.
U.S. defense and foreign policy.
Okay.
Specifically, we are going to be cracking open a chapter, Section 2, Chapter 4, from this document called Project 2025, Mandate for Leadership, the Conservative Promise.
Okay.
And it's essentially a whole bunch of policy suggestions from a conservative perspective for the next presidential administration.
Okay.
One of the things that really stood out to me in this chapter right off the bat was the claim that the U.S. military is the oldest, smallest, and least ready in its history. So that's
Oh.
a pretty striking,
Yeah, it's a striking claim.
especially when you
Well,
consider the sheer size and scope of the Department of Defense. I mean,
Yeah.
we're talking about almost 3 million personnel
wow.
and an annual budget of around $850 billion.
Yeah, that's not exactly chump change.
No, it's not.
So when this chapter, written by Christopher Miller,
Yeah.
who was the former acting Secretary of Defense,
Right. Calls the DoD a deeply troubled institution, it's kind of a big deal.
yeah, I mean, that's a pretty serious charge to
Yeah,
level.
it points to a lot of issues.
Yeah.
From historically low recruiting numbers
Right.
to what he calls the prioritization of leftist politics over military readiness.
Mm.
And all of that, I guess, in his view, is leading to a military that is not as prepared as it should be for the challenges of the 21st century.
Yeah, and he connects these internal challenges to kind of a broader context as well. Things like budget cuts, the changing nature of warfare itself. Technology's evolving at an incredible pace, and it seems like he's arguing that the U.S. military isn't adapting fast enough
To keep up.
with those changes, yeah.
And I think he also brings up sequestration.
Yes.
Can you remind me what that was again?
Oh, yeah. Sequestration refers to a series of automatic across-the-board spending cuts
Okay.
that were implemented back in 2013 after Congress failed to agree on a deficit reduction plan. And these cuts impacted a wide range of government programs, including the Department of Defense.
Gotcha.
And Miller argues that these cuts have significantly hampered the military's ability to maintain readiness
Okay.
and modernize its forces.
So basically he's saying that the military's been kind of hamstrung, both by internal issues and external pressures.
Right, they're being squeezed from both sides.
And all of this is happening while the world is getting more complex
Yes.
and dangerous.
More volatile, definitely.
The chapter really zeroes in on one particular threat, and that's China.
Uh-huh.
They call China the most significant danger to America's security and prosperity.
They do, and they're particularly concerned about China's rapid military buildup and their ambitions in Asia, specifically regarding Taiwan.
Yeah.
The chapter highlights the fact that China is investing heavily in these very advanced technologies like hypersonic missiles, artificial intelligence, and they're rapidly expanding their nuclear arsenal.
So China is kind of the big bad wolf at the door, but they also mention other threats like Russia, Iran, and North Korea, right?
They do. Yeah, those are all still considered significant threats, but the chapter definitely frames China as kind of the primary challenge.
It seems like they're painting a pretty bleak picture.
They are in some ways, but they're also offering a way forward,
Okay.
a strategic approach they call denial defense.
What is denial defense?
Essentially, the idea is to make it so costly and difficult for China to take any aggressive action, like trying to take control of Taiwan,
Gotcha.
that they wouldn't even consider it in the first place.
Oh, so it's like building a fortress so strong that nobody would even try to attack it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about deterrence, making sure the U.S. military is so powerful that nobody would dare mess with them.
To make them think twice.
Yeah, make them think twice.
Is
Exactly.
that about even trying anything?
Yeah. And to achieve that, Miller lays out a whole series of reforms for basically every branch of the military.
Okay.
The Army, Navy, Air Force, you name it. He gets into some pretty specific details, like increasing troop levels, developing new weapons systems, even changing the way the National Guard is deployed.
Wow, so this is a really comprehensive plan.
It is. It's a pretty ambitious vision for the future of U.S. defense.
Okay, well, let's dive into some of those recommendations. You mentioned troop levels. Are we talking about a big increase here?
Yeah, for the Army, Miller suggests boosting the force structure by 50,000 soldiers.
Wow, 50,000.
Which is a pretty substantial increase.
That's a lot of people.
It is, and he argues that this is necessary to ensure that the U.S. can handle two major conflicts simultaneously.
So he's thinking big.
He's thinking about the possibility of having to fight a war on two fronts.
And I'm guessing he's not just talking about adding more bodies.
No, he's also talking about modernizing the Army's equipment and training.
Okay.
He emphasizes the need to invest in these advanced technologies, like artificial intelligence, robotics, directed energy weapons, And he also calls for a greater focus on training for large-scale combat operations.
Gotcha. So it's not just about quantity, it's about quality as well.
Exactly. It's about making sure that the Army is equipped and prepared for the kinds of wars that we might face in the future.
Which are probably going to look very different.
Very different, yeah, from the wars of the past.
What about the Navy? I imagine they've got a pretty big role to play in all of this, especially when it comes to countering China in the Pacific.
Absolutely. Miller wants to see a bigger, more powerful fleet with a goal of building what he calls a 355-plus ship Navy.
Okay.
That's a number that's been debated for years.
Yeah, I've heard that number thrown around.
It has, and it would represent a significant increase from the current size of the fleet.
I can only imagine how much that would cost.
Yeah, it would be a massive investment.
And what kind of ships are we talking about here? Aircraft carriers, submarines?
All of the above. He calls for a mix of new ships, including aircraft carriers, submarines, destroyers, amphibious assault ships, and he stresses the importance of developing weapon systems that have greater range and lethality, particularly those that can counter China's growing anti-ship missile capabilities.
So it's about projecting power
Exactly.
across vast distances.
It is.
Makes sense, especially if we're talking about a potential conflict in the Pacific.
Right? You need to be able to operate far from your own shores.
But what about speed? Can the Navy keep up with the rapid pace of technological change? I know Miller seems to be concerned about that.
He is, and he proposes an interesting solution. He suggests that the Navy create a Rapid Capabilities Office, similar to the one that the Space Force already has.
Okay.
And the idea is to kind of streamline the process of developing and deploying new technologies so that the Navy can adapt more quickly to emerging threats.
That makes sense. It's like he's saying the Navy needs to be more agile.
Exactly. More agile and innovative.
Okay, moving on to the Air Force. They've got a lot on their plate too, right?
Oh, absolutely they do.
From aging aircraft to the increasing importance of space and cyber warfare.
Right. Those are all major challenges for the Air Force.
Miller has a lot of recommendations for them.
He does. He has a whole laundry list.
What are some of the big ones?
Starting with a dramatic increase in the production of the F-35A fighter jet
Okay.
and the B-21 bomber.
I've heard the F-35 has been kind of a controversial program.
It's had its share of cost overruns and technical problems.
Is Miller a big believer in it?
He sees the F-35 as a key component of the future of air power.
Okay.
And he believes that the U.S. needs to invest heavily in it.
Interesting.
He also calls for greater investment in those advanced long-range weapons we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
You know, the kind that can strike targets deep inside enemy territory.
Okay, so he wants to make sure the Air Force can hit hard.
Exactly.
And from a distance.
Hit hard from afar.
And what about this whole electromagnetic spectrum thing? I know that's become a big deal in recent years.
It has, and Miller argues that the Air Force has been neglecting this critical domain for too long.
What exactly is the electromagnetic spectrum?
It's essentially the invisible battlefield where all those electronic signals, radar communications operate.
Okay.
And Miller believes that the U.S. needs to invest heavily in capabilities that can dominate this spectrum.
So it's not just about planes and missiles anymore.
No, it's about controlling those invisible waves that everything relies on.
Sounds pretty high-tech and futuristic.
It is. It's a whole new dimension of warfare.
Okay, we've talked about the Army, Navy, and Air Force. Now let's get to the new kid on the block, the Space Force.
Right. The newest branch of the military.
I'm guessing Miller has some ambitious plans for them as well.
He does. He argues that the U.S. needs to reestablish its offensive capabilities in space.
Interesting.
You know, under the current administration, the focus has been primarily on defense.
Okay.
Protecting our satellites and other space assets.
Right.
But Miller believes that a strong offense is also essential for deterrence.
So he's not just talking about protecting our stuff in space. He's talking about being able to attack other countries' space assets if necessary.
That's right. He believes that the U.S. needs to be prepared to fight and win a war in space, if it comes to that.
That's a pretty big shift in thinking.
It is. It's a recognition that space is becoming increasingly militarized.
What else does he recommend for the Space Force?
Well, he also wants to reduce overclassification within the Space Force.
Okay.
Make it easier to share information and collaborate, which he believes will foster innovation.
Gotcha. So break down those barriers.
Exactly.
And he even floats the idea of a dedicated Space Force Academy.
Yeah, that was a pretty interesting proposal.
A Space Force Academy?
Huh?
That sounds straight out of science fiction.
It does, doesn't it?
Is that even realistic?
Well, Miller suggests that it could initially be attached to an existing research university,
Hmm.
like Caltech or MIT,
Okay.
and then eventually become a standalone institution.
So start small and then build it up.
Exactly.
Wow, that would be a pretty significant development.
It would be a major commitment to the future of space power.
Okay, we've covered the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Space Force.
Yeah.
What about Cyber Command?
All right, Cyber Command.
They're dealing with a whole different kind of battlefield.
They are. It's the digital battlefield.
What does Miller recommend for them?
Well, first of all, he argues that Cyber Command needs to be completely independent from the NSA. Right now, they share leadership, which he believes hinders their effectiveness.
So a clear separation of powers to allow Cyber Command to focus on its mission.
Right.
What else?
He calls for an expansion of both offensive and defensive cyber operations.
Okay.
He stresses the need to be prepared to strike back against adversaries who launch cyber attacks against the U.S.
So a strong deterrent in the cyber domain.
Exactly.
It's kind of mind-blowing to think about cyber warfare, space warfare. It really does feel like we're living in a sci-fi movie sometimes.
It does, doesn't it? But these are the realities of the 21st century security environment.
Okay, last but not least, let's talk about Special Operations Forces.
Right, special ops.
What role do they play in all of this?
Well, Miller argues for a much broader definition of irregular warfare. Traditionally, that term has been associated with fighting non-state actors.
Like terrorist groups?
Exactly. But Miller wants to expand it to include things like economic warfare and information warfare, specifically targeting rival states like China.
So Special Operations Forces wouldn't just be fighting terrorists, they'd be involved in a much wider range of activities.
Exactly.
Including countering economic and political influence.
That's right.
So their role would be significantly expanded in this vision.
It would be a much more multifaceted role.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from kind of the overall assessment of the Department of Defense to specific recommendations for each branch of the military. It's clear that Miller and the authors of Project 2025 believe that the U.S. needs to take a much more assertive and prepared approach to defense.
They see a world that's becoming increasingly dangerous.
And they believe that the U.S. needs to be ready to meet those challenges head on.
Yeah, they're calling for a pretty significant shift in U.S. defense posture.
It's a pretty bold vision.
It is, and it definitely raises some questions.
It does. It raises a lot of questions.
Lots of questions.
Like, how much is all of this going to cost? And are we really prepared to be in a constant state of military readiness?
Yeah, those are good questions.
I mean, it seems like they're seeing threats everywhere.
They are. They're painting a pretty stark picture of the world.
And that's something that we're going to be exploring in more detail in the next part of our deep dive into Project 2025.
Right. We're going to dig deeper into the specifics of their recommendations.
And see what they have to say about things like nuclear deterrence, missile defense, and the role of the U.S. in the world.
It's going to be a fascinating discussion.
So stay tuned.
And we'll see you next time.
It's a pretty bold vision, and it definitely raises some questions like, how much is all this going to cost? And are we really prepared to be in this constant state of military readiness? I mean, they seem to be seeing threats everywhere.
Yeah, that's a valid concern. The chapter doesn't shy away from the fact that these reforms would require a significant increase in military spending. And they argue that it's a necessary investment given the scale of the challenges facing the U.S. But they also acknowledge the need to be strategic and efficient with those resources.
So no blank checks for the Pentagon.
No, they're not advocating for just throwing money at the problem.
They actually get into some pretty specific details about how they would streamline the military and make it more effective, right?
Right.
Like, I remember reading something about some pretty significant changes to the Marine Corps.
Yeah, they proposed some pretty radical changes to the Marine Corps as part of their Force Design 2030 plan.
Okay.
Essentially, they want to shift away from traditional heavy armor and artillery and move towards lighter, more mobile units that are better suited for a potential conflict with China in the Pacific. For example, they recommend eliminating tank battalions and reducing the number of traditional artillery batteries.
So less emphasis on those big lumbering tanks.
Right, exactly.
And more on speed and agility.
Yeah, it's about being able to move quickly and strike from unexpected directions.
And what are they planning to replace those artillery batteries with?
They want to increase the number of rocket artillery batteries, specifically those equipped with HIMARS, high mobility artillery rocket systems.
Oh, yeah.
Those are truck-mounted rocket launchers that can hit targets from much greater distances than traditional artillery.
Okay.
And they're also much more mobile.
Yeah. I've seen videos of those HIMARS in action. They're pretty impressive.
They are. They pack a serious punch.
And it makes sense that they'd be useful in a conflict with China where we need to be able to strike from afar.
Right, you need that long-range capability.
But getting rid of tanks altogether seems like a pretty big gamble.
It's a significant shift. The thinking is that in a potential conflict with China, tanks would be very vulnerable to their advanced anti-tank missiles and air power. So the Marines are focusing on developing capabilities that can exploit China's weaknesses, like their limited ability to project power far from their shores.
So it's about playing to our strengths.
Yeah, exactly.
Exploiting their weaknesses.
But it's about strategy, right?
Right.
Figuring out how to fight and win against a very formidable adversary.
What other interesting details jumped out at you from this chapter?
One thing that caught my attention was their discussion of the ASVAB,
The ASAP.
the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery.
Oh, yeah, I remember taking that back in the day. I think I did pretty well on the math section.
Yeah, it's the test that high school students take to determine their eligibility for military service. And they recommend making it mandatory for all high school students in schools that receive federal funding.
That seems like it could be a little controversial.
It could be. Yeah. Some people might see it as pushing kids towards the military, whether they're interested or not.
Right, like are you trying to steer them in a particular direction?
Yeah, but the chapter argues that it's really about providing students with more information and options, exposing them to the possibility of military service, even if they hadn't considered it before.
Okay.
They frame it as a way to kind of broaden students' horizons and potentially open up some new career paths.
I see their point, but I can also see how some people might view it as a form of subtle coercion,
Right.
especially if you're a student who's not academically inclined and you're suddenly being told you have to take this military aptitude test.
Yeah, it could feel like they're trying to follow you into a particular track.
Right.
But the chapter also makes a point about, the changing nature of warfare
Yeah.
and how it's not just about those traditional combat skills anymore.
Right. They talk a lot about things like cyber warfare and information warfare
Right.
and how those are becoming increasingly important in the 21st century.
Exactly. And they argue that the military needs to attract a broader range of talent, including people with skills in science, technology, engineering, and math, the STEM fields.
So maybe the ASVAB isn't just about identifying potential soldiers.
Right.
Maybe it's also about identifying potential scientists, engineers, and cyber warriors.
Exactly. It's about looking for a wider range of aptitudes and skills.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about another key theme that runs throughout this chapter, nuclear deterrence.
Okay, nuclear deterrence.
It seems like they're pretty concerned about the current state of America's nuclear arsenal.
They argue that the U.S. nuclear triad are land-based missiles, submarine-launched missiles, and strategic bombers,
Right.
is aging and in need of modernization, and they're particularly worried about China's rapid nuclear expansion.
Yeah, I've heard that some of those nuclear missiles are decades old.
Some of them date back to the Cold War.
Is it really that big of a deal? I mean, they're not exactly using them every day.
Well, the chapter argues that the reliability and effectiveness of our nuclear deterrent depends on having modern, up-to-date weapon systems.
Oh.
They point out that if our adversaries believe that our nuclear weapons are unreliable, it could embolden them to take risks and potentially lead to a miscalculation.
So it's not just about having nukes, it's about having nukes that actually work.
Exactly.
And that our adversaries believe will work?
It's all about maintaining a credible deterrent.
Okay.
And they argue that the current state of our nuclear forces simply isn't sustainable if we want to maintain that deterrent, especially with China rapidly expanding its nuclear arsenal.
Okay, so they want to modernize our nuclear weapons, but what about arms control?
Right.
Is there any room for that in this vision?
They do mention the potential for arms control,
Okay.
but they emphasize the need to negotiate from a position of strength. They argue that we can't simply rely on the goodwill of our adversaries.
Right.
We need to be prepared to match their capabilities if necessary.
So peace through strength is the motto here.
That seems to be their guiding principle.
But some people might argue that building up our nuclear arsenal just makes the world more dangerous.
Yeah, that's a valid point. It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
Right.
The chapter acknowledges the potential risks of an arms race, but they ultimately believe that a strong nuclear deterrent is the best way to prevent conflict.
And what about missile defense? I know that's been a big topic of debate for years.
It has.
What's their take on that?
They're strong advocates for missile defense.
Okay.
They highlight the growing threat posed by hypersonic missiles, which are extremely difficult to intercept.
Yeah.
And they call for investing in advanced technologies to counter those threats.
So the idea is that a robust missile defense system could help deter attacks in the first place, or at least mitigate the damage if deterrence fails.
Both the chapter argues that missile defense can play a vital role in protecting the U.S. and its allies from a wide range of threats, including ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and hypersonic weapons.
Okay. So they're taking a pretty hawkish stance on defense. They see a lot of threats out there, and they believe the U.S. needs to be prepared to meet those threats head on. But they're not just advocating for more spending.
Right.
They're also proposing some pretty significant changes to the structure and strategy of the military.
Yeah, they're talking about fundamentally rethinking how the U.S. military operates in the 21st century.
And a big part of that seems to be the shift towards a more agile and adaptable force.
Exactly. They recognize that the nature of warfare is changing and that the U.S. needs to be able to respond quickly and effectively to a wide range of threats, from traditional military conflicts to cyber attacks and information warfare.
It's a lot to take in, for sure. And it raises some important questions about the role of the U.S. in the world and what kind of military we need to maintain our security and interests.
Absolutely. This chapter offers a glimpse into one particular perspective on those questions, and it's certainly a perspective that deserves careful consideration.
Okay, we've talked a lot about the big picture stuff, the overall vision for U.S. defense.
Right, the grand strategy.
But I'm curious about some of the more specific details in this chapter. What else stood out to you?
Well, one thing that caught my eye was the recommendation to eliminate law enforcement battalions within the Marine Corps.
Really?
Yeah.
Why would they suggest that?
It seems to be part of their effort to streamline the Marine Corps and focus more on their core mission of amphibious warfare. You know, they argue that law enforcement functions can be handled by other branches of the military or by civilian law enforcement agencies.
Interesting. It's like they're really trying to strip the Marine Corps down to its bare essentials.
Yeah, exactly.
And make sure every unit is optimized for a potential conflict with China?
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
They're all about maximizing combat effectiveness.
What else?
They also suggest that the Marine Corps should eliminate the majority of their tube artillery batteries. Those are the ones that use traditional cannons.
Okay, and what are they planning to replace them with?
More rocket artillery batteries, specifically those equipped with HIMARS. They argue that rocket artillery is more mobile and versatile and better suited for the kinds of conflicts they envision the Marine Corps fighting in the future.
It sounds like they're trying to create a force that's fast, flexible, and packs a serious punch.
Exactly. A force that can move quickly, strike hard, and disappear before the enemy even knows what hit them.
And speaking of expanding the definition of warfare,
Right.
They also talk about the need to broaden the concept of irregular warfare to encompass things like economic warfare and information warfare.
Right. It's not just about boots on the ground anymore. It's
that-
about using all the tools at our disposal. Economic sanctions, cyber attacks, propaganda,
Yeah.
to achieve our strategic objectives.
It's a much more holistic approach to conflict, recognizing that in the 21st century, wars aren't just fought on battlefields.
Exactly. They're fought in the minds of people in the global economy and cyberspace.
It sounds like a pretty aggressive strategy, though.
It is. It's definitely a more assertive approach.
I mean, if we start engaging in economic warfare and cyber attacks against China, couldn't that escalate things pretty quickly?
It's certainly a risk, and that's why the chapter emphasizes the need for a strong deterrent. The idea is to make it clear to potential adversaries that any aggressive actions will be met with a swift and decisive response.
So it's all about walking that tightrope
Yeah.
between deterrence and provocation,
It's a delicate balance for sure.
trying to project strength without inadvertently starting a war.
Right? You want to be strong enough to deter aggression,
Yeah.
but not so aggressive that you provoke it.
Okay, so we've talked about China, Russia, Iran, North Korea terrorism. It sounds like this Project 2025 vision sees threats everywhere.
They do. They seem to believe that the U.S. is facing a multitude of challenges.
So are they advocating for a constant state of war?
Not necessarily, but they do believe that the U.S. needs to be prepared to fight on multiple fronts, both literally and figuratively. They see a world where American power is being challenged, and they believe that a strong military is the key to maintaining peace and security. They use the phrase peace through strength quite a bit.
Yeah, I noticed that too. Peace through strength. It's like a mantra for them.
It's a classic realist concept, the idea that a powerful military deters aggression and prevents war. It's a philosophy that's been embraced by many U.S. presidents throughout history.
But it's not without its critics, right?
Of course not. There are those who argue that a massive military buildup can actually make the world less safe potentially leading to an arms race or increasing the likelihood of conflict.
Right, because if everyone is building up their militaries, it
Yeah.
creates a climate of fear and suspicion,
Exactly.
which can make it more likely that a small dispute will spiral out of control.
Right. It can create a self-fulfilling prophecy.
And there's also the argument that a strong military can sometimes tempt leaders to use force when it's not necessary,
Yeah.
or to overestimate their ability to achieve their objectives through military means.
Right. Sometimes having a big hammer makes you want to use it even when it's not the right tool for the job.
It's like that old saying, if all you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So while Project 2025 clearly believes in the importance of a strong military, it's important to acknowledge the potential downsides of that approach as well. It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from the overall vision for U.S. defense to some of the specific details and potential downsides. But there's one more area I want to touch on before we wrap up: the human cost of war.
Yeah, that's a crucial point. It's easy to get caught up in these discussions of strategy and technology.
Right.
But we have to remember that war is ultimately about people.
And the chapter does acknowledge that, to its credit.
They do.
They talk about the need to value military families and provide them with better support and resources.
Right.
And they also delve into the issue of suicide rates within the military.
Yeah, they highlight the alarming rise in suicide rates, particularly within the Army, and they call for serious efforts to address the underlying causes of this crisis.
It's a sobering reminder that military service takes a toll not just on the individuals who serve, but also on their families and loved ones.
Absolutely. It's a heavy burden to bear.
And we can't forget about the impact on the civilians who are caught in the crossfire or who suffer the consequences of war long after the fighting has ended.
Right. War leaves scars that can last for generations.
It's important to remember that war is never a clean or easy solution.
It's not.
It always comes at a price, and that's something we should all keep in mind as we grapple with these complex issues of defense and foreign policy.
Well said. It's easy to get caught up in the abstract discussions. But we have to remember that there are real human lives at stake.
Okay, I think we've explored just about every nook and cranny of this chapter.
We have, and it's given us a lot to think about.
It really has. This chapter from Project 2025 lays out a very specific vision for the future of U.S. defense.
It does.
It's a vision built on a peace through strength philosophy, a strong military to deter adversaries, advanced technologies to stay ahead of the game, and a willingness to use all the tools at our disposal, from economic sanctions to cyber warfare.
It's a vision that definitely prioritizes military might. They see the world as a dangerous place with threats emerging from all sides.
Yeah.
And they believe that the best way to protect American interests and values is to project strength and dominance on the global stage.
And that raises some important questions for you, the listener. Do you agree with their assessment of the threats facing the U.S.? Do you think a stronger military is the answer, or could it actually make the world less safe, as some critics argue?
These are tough questions with no easy answers, but they're questions we all need to be thinking about, because ultimately the decisions our leaders make about defense and foreign policy, they impact all of us.
Exactly. Whether we're serving in the military, working in the defense industry, or simply going about our daily lives, we're all affected by these choices. And that's why it's so important to be informed, to understand the different perspectives on these issues, and to engage in thoughtful discussions about the best way forward.
The authors of Project 2025, they present a very clear and assertive vision. But it's not the only vision out there. There are other voices, other perspectives, other ideas about how to navigate the complex challenges of the 21st century.
Right, and it's up to each of us to explore those different perspectives, to weigh the potential costs and benefits of various policy choices, and to decide what kind of world we want to live in.
Because in the end, this isn't just about abstract concepts like national security or military strategy. It's about real people's lives. It's about the men and women who serve in the military and their families. It's about the civilians who are impacted by conflict both at home and abroad. And it's about the kind of future we want to leave for generations to come.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into U.S. defense and foreign policy, I want to leave you with a final thought-provoking question. The chapter we discuss strongly advocates for increased military spending. They argue that it's essential for modernizing our forces and deterring potential adversaries. But considering the potential economic implications, the fact that those funds could be used for other priorities like education, healthcare, or infrastructure, is this the right path? And what are the trade-offs involved?
It's a question worth pondering. There's no easy answer, but it's a debate we need to have as a nation. And it's a debate that requires us to think not just about our own security, but about the kind of world we want to create, a world that's more secure, more just, and more peaceful for all.
Well said. And if this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, I encourage you to explore further. You can find the full Project 2025 document online. You can also dig deeper into the current state of U.S. military capabilities, explore different perspectives on defense and foreign policy, and engage in conversations with people who hold different views than your own.
There's a wealth of information out there. It's up to each of us to stay informed, to think critically, and to participate in the ongoing debate about the future of our nation and the world.
That's right. Okay, that's a wrap for today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious, keep learning, and be sure to challenge your assumptions.